other people will drop on in. Thank you very much for joining our webinar. So the Brador Lake Biosphere Region Association welcomes you to our first webinar, or maybe not our first webinar, but feels like it. The Brador Lake Biosphere, defined by its watershed, is located in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are all treaty people. We'd like to acknowledge that the Brador Lake Biosphere is in Unama'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are all treaty people. And the Brador Lake, or Pitubak, has been cared for by the Mi'kmaq since time immemorial. I'd like to also mention that funding for this project has been provided by Clean Foundation under the Nova Scotia Shared Coastal Park Sector's Climate Adaptation Strategy, a project which was funded by the Nova Scotia Department of Environment and Climate Change. And for this webinar, I'd like to introduce Dr. Elizabeth George, or Libby, who has a PhD from the University of Windsor. Her thesis was a study on the evolution of beach dune system on the North Shore of PEI. She's currently working as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Waterloo with the Coastal Research Group at the University of Waterloo. The group is focused on sediment transport and nearshore morphodynamics with a focus on beach dune interaction and barrier island response to sea level rise. They have field sites along the Great Lakes and in the Maritimes of Canada, as well as Costa Rica. Libby also provides us support via the GeoReach project, which she will talk about today, and which is growing, and we're really fortunate to be part of that and appreciate your involvement. Thank you. I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, sounds good. I'm just gonna start to share my screen again. All righty, everyone can see the presentation? Good stuff. All right, thanks, Veronica, for the introduction. So once again, my name is Elizabeth. I do go by Libby. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Waterloo. And my background is in coastal geomorphology. And so today I'm going to be doing a workshop on the CoastReach program for the Brador Lake Biosphere Region Association. So to start us off today, a good majority of this presentation is actually going to be about coastal geomorphology in general and kind of controls on water level and how waves are generated and what that looks like in a unique area such as the Brador Lake. So I'm going to start off here with controls on water levels. So coastal areas are very dynamic and water levels are always changing throughout the environment. So we have a couple different controls globally, which are tide, sea level rise, and then we also have lake level changes and storm surges. And so particularly in Brador, I know that the tide influence is very minimal, but so we're going to focus a lot more on sea level rise and kind of lake level changes today. So global mean sea level rise. So this is part of the water level influence within the Brador. So these are factors that are occurring globally, so such as additional volume to the oceans from glaciers and the melting of massive ice sheets due to global warming. And then on top of global mean sea level rise, we also have relative sea level rise. And so these are factors that will affect how a regional area is experiencing global mean sea level rise. So such as if a certain geologic area is experiencing tectonic uplift or submergence due to isostatic rebound. And so, for example, in the Maritimes, and so Nova Scotia experiences this along with PEI, there's actually a bit of subsidence occurring due to isostatic rebound. So the massive volume of glaciers that was over this ice cap area here. There, we have some isostatic rebound happening there after the glaciers went away, and that's actually causing a bit of a pivot and some submergence or just slowly sinking land out here on the East Coast. So that's one of the relative sea level rise factors there. And another control on water level is storm surge. So when very high powered winds are pushing water towards the land, the water begins to surge and run up onto the landscape. So this is a very high impact on low-lying communities and especially low gradient coastlines. On top of this, large waves can occur on this surge, which makes these storms very impactful. And in certain areas, storm surge can actually be funneled by bathymetry. So this is an example in the UK and in Europe, but I promise all of this is going to tie together just because Brador Lake has a very unique orientation with regards to the shoreline. But if you can see from the example on this slide, storm surge in a funneled area, it can actually continue to pile up as it is funneled into a specific area. So, um, in combination, that is how all of these controls are felt. So it's not just tides, it's not just storm surge, it's global mean sea level rise, relative sea level rise, storm surge on top of that. And these are what we experience with our water level controls. Now in Brador, since it's a very unique sort of like estuary environment, but there's not a huge tide influence, it's a lot more coupled towards our general sort of hydrological cycle. So a lot more factor influence from ice and snow melt, precipitation, temperature and evaporation. And this is something that we also see in the Great Lakes as well over here in Ontario. And another neat thing that happens in the Great Lakes and also in Brador is seiches. So seiches are kind of like a version of storm surge in lake environments as opposed to oceanic environments. And so the reason they're interesting is because when storm surge is consistently pushed to one side of the lake, it almost creates sort of a bathtub effect where the water level is actually going to dip on that opposite side when it's rising on the other side, and then once that wind generation starts to die down, it actually kind of almost begins to slosh back and forth, which is kind of a really unique storm surge that occurs in these lake environments. So if we start to look at the orientation of Brador Lake and these different shoreline orientations, we can start to think about how those different storm surges might begin to pile up in different areas with associated incident wind directions. So from that, we're going to lead into how waves are generated. So specifically, wind-generated waves are created from wind disturbing the water surface. And the size of the waves is directly proportional to the fetch length in wind speed and the duration of that wind speed. And so with fetch length being distance across the water that the wind is blowing unobstructed. So again, if we look back to all these unique shoreline orientations, you can think about how with different instant wind angles, different types of storms that might be passing over the area, there's all these kind of different fetch lengths that could be happening because of all of these unique shapes across the lake. And so waves begin to break, and when they're feeling the bottom of nearshore bathymetry. And so this actually begins to start happening when the depth of that bathymetry is approximately 1/2 of the length of that wave. And so when this depth begins to occur, the wave starts to shoal and it grows in height until it eventually becomes unstable and breaks. And so the height of the breaking waves and run up of those waves onshore is controlled by incident wave height and nearshore bathymetry. And so I know I'm talking about some pretty general concepts, but you can start to just think about how all these different areas across Broad Lake, how these this wave energy or storm surges will be experienced differently in these different areas because of the unique shape of the lake. And so higher energy, larger breaking waves. So if we have a really long fetch distance across the lake from a storm and really high wind speeds, and we have these higher energy waves approaching, they are going to have a higher height as they are coming onto the shore. And these higher energy waves result in transport offshore away from the beach because there's so much run up and surge pounding onto the beach and it's sucking all that sediment back out. Whereas lower energy, smaller breaking waves actually facilitate transport towards the beach. And so this is associated with fall velocity, which is the amount of time that it takes sediment to reach the bottom before the next wave. So if you can think about a sandy system, and we're thinking about high energy waves that are constantly pounding onto the shoreline, all that sand doesn't actually have enough time to reach the bottom before it's being sucked out by those high energy waves. Whereas in lower energy wave environments, these waves are essentially just picking up these little grains and they're falling down before the waves can actually suck them back offshore. And so something interesting that happens with this as well is that during storms, larger materials will get thrown onto the beach, and while those smaller materials are getting pulled off. So sometimes after really big storms, you might notice that there's maybe some larger cobbles on the beach that aren't usually there. That's because these larger cobbles, since they're heavier and they have a quicker falling velocity, these are just getting upchucked onto the beach during the storm, while all these tiny pieces of sand are getting pulled off. And so, in summary, higher energy waves are more associated with erosion, pulling those finer sediments off of the beach, whereas lower energy waves are associated with accretion and deposition and recovery of these sandy areas. And so with storm impact and recovery, again, storm impacts are felt in combination with that surge or that tide and that wave height built on top. It can erode the system, bring that sand or those finer materials out into the near shore, and remove that sediment. And this will start to change the structure of the beach and the near shore. And then so between storm impact and recovery, we have these different timelines and we start to see a certain balance in the geomorphology of these systems where there's this exchange between these lower energy waves moving sediment back and these higher energy waves that start to bring the sand away. And so when we start to see an increase in frequency of these intense storms due to climate change, such as hurricanes tracking from the Atlantic Ocean from down south, we start to see our systems are just being bombarded and bombarded by these high energy events, and they have limited time to recover in between. And so recovery of these systems also depends on cross-shore and along-shore transport of these sediment sources from other areas. So specifically, cross-shore transport is what I was just referring to, where the lower energy waves are slowly moving that sediment back towards the beach to help it recover. And then this sediment also has to enter the cross-shore system from along-shore transport sources. And so you can start to understand how different areas start to become connected across the lakes or across coastal systems. So along-shore transport will begin to feed our cross-shore transport and vice versa, and it's all a linked system. So for along-shore transport, sediment is transported along the coastline due to along-shore currents and wave interaction reaching the coastline. And so the sediment can move down the coastline in these steps, which are called, it's called mostly beach drift. So this can happen out in the near shore or directly on the beach, where the waves are approaching at an angle but then they always come straight back out with gravity. And then so this can slowly move sediment in these little steps down along the coastline. And so we can start to think about how our different systems are connected between our different sediment budgets. So typically there's different sources and sinks in different coastal areas. And so erosion of an area can actually be a source of sediment for somewhere downdrift. So for an example, a river can be a sediment source supply, and or eroding bluffs could be a sediment source supply to a barrier along shore. And then we can also have sediment can be lost deep out beyond the near shore into offshore canyons or other kinds of sinks. And so when we start to think about bluffs and cliffs, so as we're starting to think about the different geologies that we see in coastal systems, so not everything is just sandy, right? So sometimes we have our rocky systems, and so we can get wave refraction around these materials, around headlands, and this could lead to increased erosion on either side of these headlands, creating different kinds of undulations in the coastline. Um, and bluff and cliff erosion, again, are a source of sediment, an important source of sediment for downdrift areas. And so as I continue to talk about this, I just want you to think about how different types of geologic material result in different types of coastline evolution and how everything is interconnected. And so when we start to think a little bit more about our bluffs and cliffs, so these erode just like our sandy coastlines do. However, it's a lot harder for a bluff to fully recover in height than our sandy beaches. And we also have bluffs and cliffs that are composed of different materials. So, for example, a cliff or a bluff that is composed of sandy soil will likely erode a lot faster than a cliff with higher clay content that likes to stay compacted together. And so bluffs and cliffs primarily become eroded due to the waves hitting the base or the toe of the cliff. And then so this will begin undercutting the cliff and then eventually cause slumping, and that which causes retreat of the cliff. And then in front of our cliffs, sometimes we can have sandy beaches. And so increase in storminess and sea level can also result in a constriction of the sandy beach area while these cliffs are eroding. And so we start to see all kinds of sort of coastal changes occurring while due to our water level controls. And so this is actually an example from Marble Mountain site here. So you can see how the waves are actually coming up and undercutting parts of the cliff here, and then that is resulting in slumping. And so, due to all this kind of erosion that's taking place, which can be very upsetting if you have a home that's on a coastline or you own property on a coastline. And so, as humans, we start to interact with our environments and start modifying our shorelines. So, some of the modifications we start to see can be hard or gray modifications or soft or green modifications, which I'm not going to get too much into today. But our hard modifications armor the shoreline, and these can also decrease ecological integrity and cause further erosion and restriction of sediment supply. And so, even though everyone wants to throw this hard armoring onto the coastline to protect from erosion, this can actually further damage the system. And so, the alternative would be soft or green modification, which involves methodologies such as nourishment and vegetation restoration or a focus on ecosystems. But these are also very complicated. This is sort of a newer adaptation in Canada that we are just really starting to get to know. And in combination with climate change, we are having to constantly reassess these areas to understand which types of modifications are going to be the most beneficial for both the people living in these areas and for these coastal systems and the ecological systems. And so other modifications that we see are also harbor jetties or groins, and these tend to collect sediment, which leads to erosion downshore or sediment starvation downshore, which in turn can begin to affect our barrier islands or our beaches and dunes as they're trying to recover from storm impact. And so to kind of bring all of this together, so barrier islands and spits are depositional features, and they're combinations of a longshore and cross-shore transport. They are products of past and present coastal geology, sediment supply, water levels, and wave energy. And just from a global perspective here, the US has about 40% of the world's barrier islands, but we also have quite a few within Canada in the Great Lakes and also across the Maritimes. And so bringing this into the broad door context. So in broad door, we have quite a mixture of shoreline types and substrate types. We also have unique fetch limited environments, like I was sort of demonstrating on the maps earlier. So some areas are going to experience higher energy waves than others. I've also have been informed by Veronica and Colette that there's been a decrease in winter ice. And so this is a really key player in some of our Great Lakes systems and our other maritime systems because the ice helps buffer intense winter wave energy. So with the removal of this ice, these areas are starting to experience more erosion and higher energy during the winter as well. And then in combination, like I mentioned before, we're also starting to see an increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme storms. So for example, hurricanes tracking from the south, like Hurricanes Dorian and Fiona. So, our research group started to think about how can we start monitoring everything everywhere all at once and have a sort of all-seeing monitoring system to start to understand where are these sediment exchanges beginning to occur, how are these systems changing in the Great Lakes and also in Atlantic Canada. And so this all started with the COASTI program, which is a citizen science photo monitoring program focused on coastal landscapes that we developed with Parks Canada back in 2021. And so this is based on the International CoastNat program that was developed by Mitch Harley at the University of New South Wales in Australia. And so when we initially brought this idea to Parks Canada, we were all really excited about it until they found out that the images for CoastNet are actually hosted on servers in the USA. And so the government of Canada was not super excited about that. And we essentially started to create our own program from scratch with Parks Canada, which became the COASTI program collaboration. And so since 2021, we've had over 10,000 image submissions for this program. We have 13 participating parks, and our expansion was funded by both Parks Canada and Canadian Geological Society. And the images are open source and free to access. And then from COASTI, we wanted to get outside of our national parks. We wanted to expand into municipalities and conservation areas and provincial parks. And so we developed the CoastReach program, which is functionally identical to the COASTI program. It's just expanding out into these different areas. And CoastReach is also a facet of now a broader reaching framework, GeoReach. So a more all-encompassing program to look at our different landscapes in Canada. So we have now the CoastReach program, Glacier Reach, River Reach, Regen Reach, and Marsh Reach. And CoastReach obviously is what I'm going to continue talking about today. And so how does this work? It's very simple. To submit an image as a citizen scientist, you just have to walk up to one of the stands. There's going to be a panel there with a QR code and a bit of a description. You just have to place your phone in the stand, take a photo of the area at that site, and then scan the QR code to submit the image. And then when you scan the QR code, it'll take you to the CoastReach landing page, and you just have to click on Submit CoastReach, and then you can search for your area and upload your image. So currently, what we're doing with this project right now is we have a lot of focused expansion in the Great Lakes. So this is due to funding acquired through ECCC and Canada Water Agency. And so we've established 39 new stands within the past year and counting. However, we also are still looking to expand in Atlantic Canada, which is why I'm here talking today, since we are partnering up with BLBRA to help them with some monitoring efforts. So as you can see, there's quite a few different COASTI and CoastReach sites that have been funded in part by various partners across the East Coast. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about data analysis over the next couple slides. So I like to say that there are two different streams of data analysis for these projects. So the first is qualitative, which is essentially time series photo monitoring of shoreline dynamics and of a coastal environment. So if you can think of having these repeat images over time into a time lapse, you can look at changes throughout that video from those overlapping images. So from this, you can look at changes in shoreline position, changes in substrate, increase or decrease in vegetation, ecosystem dynamics, and also the presence or absence of nuisance algae. And the quantitative stream involves georectification of images by surveying ground control points in the background of your sites of focus and processing these in MATLAB or Python. So this is a little bit more intensive side of the program. So this involves centimeter level GCP surveying. But from this, we can get quantitative monitoring of shoreline position, so actual geospatial position of how that shoreline is moving through time to look at those dynamics, and we can also quantify erosion. So as a qualitative example, this is the Point Pelee cuspate foreland. So this is looks like a spit that is just jutting straight into Lake Erie over here in Ontario. So this is a really interesting area because we have different kinds of wave and sediment sources from both sides. So this is a really interesting place to watch. But this is before and after the arrival of Hurricane Helene remnants in July of 2025. And so you can see over just a few weeks, there's quite a bit of valuable qualitative data that we can get from these images that help us understand the system better. And then over on the quantitative side, I used, as part of the research for my PhD, I actually used coastal images to evaluate erosion that was volume loss from the foredunes in PEI following Hurricane Fiona. And so what is this weird georectification I'm talking about? And so essentially georectification is when we are taking these portrait images of the landscape, and through processing through these MATLAB scripts, we are able to essentially splay that out into a projected map. And then we are able to extract actual geospatial positions of these shorelines through time. Which is really interesting. And so these little green points sort of at the end of the boardwalk here, those are examples of ground control points at the specific site at Brackley Beach in Prince Edward Island National Park. And so the image on the left would be an input image that is collected from the stand, and the image on the right would be the georectified image. And so you can see how the program is starting to just sort of stretch that image out. It's trying to geospatially fit it to where it occurs in real life. And then from there, we get the yellow line there is the result of the shoreline that we can get from that image. And so following Hurricane Fiona, if you see these red stars, these are examples of ground control points that I had before and after the storm. So I don't know if you can see, but a few of these actually were completely removed. And that is kind of just how it works with these programs, since our coastal environments are so dynamic and changing. We have to constantly sort of reassess those ground control points and choose new ones or establish new ones. But using the coastal images, I was able to get actual erosion estimates using a combination of shoreline information and also essentially projecting beach elevation back towards the dunes using these post-storm shorelines. And from there, I was able to get estimates of dune volume loss, and that was pretty cool. I ended up getting actually really close to our post-storm UAS estimates. So we were on site post-storm doing high accuracy drone surveys, and then I was able to compare these coastal results to those drone surveys, and I actually got pretty close. So one of the profiles I actually got within 2 meters cubed of the loss that was calculated by the drone survey. So that was really neat. And so that's kind of where this is kind of like the best case scenario of where this kind of data can take us in terms of monitoring and managing our coastal resources with proper site setup with these ground control points. And so with that, I'm just going to kind of end off here looking at sort of a couple of the broad door sites that BLBRA is hoping to establish with the CoastReach program. So this year they're hoping to install 3 stations with some of their new funding. And so the areas we are focusing on are Eskasoni, Marble Mountain, and also Iona. And in case anyone is wondering how or where these images go. So if anyone is interested in signing up to have access to these images once the program has been established, you just have to send an email to UN Coastal Research Group at gmail.com. And we essentially give you access to the research analytics portal where you are able to see the different images that are collected through this program. And you can also download them whenever you want. So with that, if anyone has any direct questions for me, I can answer some. I'll leave my screen up for a few minutes just in case you want me to go back to any of those slides. But I think we were kind of thinking that could just like open the floor to Colette and Veronica as well for any questions about